At 4:52 on August 23, 1944, the alley behind Świętokrzyska Street was black and wet from a night rain. Warsaw was in its fourth week of uprising. The electric grid was dead. Fires in the city center provided the only light, orange pulses behind a wall of smoke. Corporal Merrick Kruk Nowak was 24. He wore a Home Army armband over a civilian jacket, a German M35 helmet with the insignia scraped off, and a captured MP40 slung low across his chest. He had 3 magazines left. 90 rounds, if the springs fed clean. He was posted in the alley because it was the shortest path between 2 barricades, and because every short path in Warsaw had become a killing lane. At 4:55, he crouched behind a pile of bricks and scanned the mouth of the alley. He listened. Boots. Not running yet. A measured cadence. Multiple men. The kind of walk soldiers use when they expect contact and want to keep formation. 2 meters in front of his position, spread across the alley's width, lay a strip of improvised obstacles, short lengths of wire and glass fixed into bottle bases, green and brown shards set upright like teeth. They were crude. They were also banned. Nowak did not look at the device for long. He looked past it, toward the intersection. He kept the MP40's muzzle low to avoid silhouette, fingers straight along the frame. He was not a romantic. He was a corporal with 3 magazines and a bottleneck alley, tasked with holding until the next barricade could reposition a single light machine gun, 1 RKM WZ.28, Polish-made bar pattern, 7.92 by 57 mm, 20-round magazines, worn springs, and a cracked stock. At 4:57, the alley's far end shifted. Shadows moved against the wall. The first German helmets appeared, low and cautious, leading with bayonets. The men were close enough that Nowak could make out equipment, bread bags, entrenching tools, gas mask canisters. It was an infantry probing element, likely from a security detachment, not a full assault platoon, yet. Nowak breathed through his mouth and waited. At 4:58, the lead German stepped into the alley and halted. He raised a hand. The column compressed behind him, bodies bunching in the narrow space, shoulder to shoulder. A bad formation for a firefight. A good formation for panic. Nowak's eyes moved to the glass teeth on the ground. The device wasn't a mine. It was worse in some ways. It didn't explode. It didn't warn. It simply injured and slowed, one step at a time, turning movement into noise, blood, and hesitation. It had been designed by a man who understood the geometry of an alley and the psychology of a charge. His name was Second Lieutenant Jan Żbikowski, age 29, a former engineering student turned sapper officer. He had joined the underground in 1941. By 1944, he was known in the district for building what the city could not supply: pipe bombs, improvised grenades, pressure charges for rail sabotage. He had a thin face and a thick notebook. He talked in measurements and times. Żbikowski did not invent caltrops. Armies had scattered iron spikes for centuries. But Warsaw didn't have iron to waste, and it didn't have factories to shape it. What it had was glass, wire, and the ruins of thousands of apartments. On August 9th, at 11:18, Żbikowski demonstrated his solution in a courtyard workshop near Warszawska Street. He placed 3 empty beer bottles on a table and cut them with a saw blade taken from a damaged hand drill. He removed the necks and used the bases as sockets. Into each base he cemented 4 to 6 jagged shards, angled outward. He wrapped the outside in thin wire, telephone wire scavenged from a collapsed exchange, to prevent the glass from splitting under pressure. When the cement set, the bottle base became a low, stable platform. The shards remained upright even on uneven cobblestone. He called it a caltrap, using an old term he'd found in a pre-war manual. The fighters called it the broken bottle. The point was simple. In a narrow alley, the foot has limited choices. A man running, looking forward, will not watch the ground. A boot sole can be punctured. A bare foot is shredded. A stumble becomes a fall. A fall becomes a pile-up. At 11:33, Żbikowski laid a row of the devices in a test lane and had two volunteers, both teenagers in rubber-soled shoes, attempt to sprint through. One stopped immediately. The other made 3 steps and yelped. The glass bit through the sole. At 11:39, a messenger arrived with the district commander's order: "Stop. Remove them. No more trials in populated courtyards." The ban came fast and without debate. By August 10th, at 16:05, the Home Army sector staff had issued a written instruction: no glass caltrops in general circulation. The reasons were logistical and moral at the same time. The alleys were not controlled spaces. Civilians ran through them. Couriers ran through them. Wounded men were carried through them on doors used as stretchers. A hidden field of glass was as likely to tear a friendly man's foot as an enemy's. It created unpredictable casualties in a city already drowning in amputations. One medic wrote in a margin note that became infamous in the unit: "We cannot afford injuries that do not stop bullets." Żbikowski argued. On August 12th, at 9:22, he met with the commander of his battalion in a cellar command post and laid out his case in numbers. A caltrop strip required no explosives, no fuse, no detonator. It could be assembled in an hour by untrained hands. It weighed almost nothing. It conserved ammunition by forcing enemy units to slow and bunch. It made the enemy shout, and shouting revealed positions. The commander listened and refused. At 9:41, the order was repeated: banned. Żbikowski complied, but he didn't destroy his work. He packed the caltrops into wooden crates marked glass and stored them in the basement of a bombed-out bakery. He wrote their location in his notebook. He assumed the city would change his commander's mind eventually. Warsaw had a way of doing that. By August 18th, the Germans had tightened their perimeter. They used heavy weapons freely. Mortars at close range. Direct-fire anti-tank guns down streets as if they were firing lanes. Flamethrowers in stairwells. The Home Army, short on ammunition and short on medical supplies, began to plan defense not by blocks but by corridors, streets, courtyards, and alleys that could be held by a handful of men with limited firepower. That was where Żbikowski's banned invention came back into the conversation. On August 22nd, at 2016, a runner reached Żbikowski's position with a request. The barricade near Świętokrzyska needed something, anything, that could slow a night assault without consuming ammunition. The unit had 1 light machine gun, 2 rifles, and several pistols. They were down to the last boxes of captured 9 by 19 mm and 7.92 mm. They could not afford a long firefight. Żbikowski opened his notebook. He did not smile. He simply gave the address of the bakery basement and the number of crates. At 21:03, 2 men retrieved them under shell fire, carrying the crates on a handcart with a broken wheel. The cart squealed, a sound that made everyone flinch. They arrived at the alley position at 22:11. They unloaded in the dark and covered the devices with scraps of cloth until it was time. Now, at 4:59 on August 23rd, Corporal Nowak watched the German lead man hesitate at the alley mouth. The column behind him pressed forward. Someone whispered a command. It came from an officer close enough to influence, but not close enough to bleed first. At 5 o'clock, the Germans started in. Nowak did not fire yet. He waited for the first step to land where Żbikowski had intended. He waited for the alley to do what alleys always do in wars: compress men into a single line, take away their options, and force them to pay for every meter. At 5 hours and 12 seconds, the first German boot came down on the strip. The sole didn't explode. It didn't flash. It just stopped moving the way it was supposed to. The man's foot skidded half a step, then caught. The shards punched up through rubber and leather. The soldier jerked his leg back on instinct and lost balance. His rifle swung wide and banged against the alley wall. The sound was sharp in the enclosed space. At 5 hours and 15 seconds, the second man behind him tried to avoid the obstacle by stepping left, toward the wall. There was no room. His shoulder struck brick. His boot landed on another bottle base. The glass held. He went down on one knee. He shouted once, short, involuntary. At 5 hours and 19 seconds, the column stalled. The men in the back couldn't see what had happened. They only felt the line stop. They pressed forward. Bodies compressed. Bayonets jabbed into packs. Someone cursed in German. Nowak watched the pileup form exactly where he wanted it. 2 meters beyond the glass strip was a slight dip where water collected. The alley floor there was slick. A stumbling man would fall hard. At 5 hours and 24 seconds, a German NCO pushed forward, trying to restore order. He leaned over the first man, grabbed his webbing, and hauled. The injured soldier's boot stayed stuck for a moment, pinned by the shards and the bottle base. When it finally came free, it left a wet smear. At 5 hours and 28 seconds, Nowak raised the MP-40. He fired a 3-round burst, controlled, muzzle low. The bullet struck at knee height. The first man folded. The second man tried to roll away but couldn't in the packed formation. The MP-40's rate of fire, roughly 500 to 550 rounds per minute, made short bursts easy to manage, but the weapon was still a submachine gun. Effective range was limited. In the alley, it didn't matter. The targets were within 20 meters. At 5 hours and 32 seconds, Nowak fired again. He aimed for the point where bodies were densest. He wanted to create confusion, not just casualties. A confusion event in a narrow lane could halt an assault longer than a few dead men. At 5 hours and 38 seconds, the Germans returned fire. 2 rifles, then more. 7.92 by 57 mm bullets snapped off brick and threw chips into the air. The alley wall became a grinder. Nowak dropped behind his brick pile and kept his head low. At 5 hours and 45 seconds, he heard the sound he wanted, boots scraping backward, men trying to reverse out while others pushed forward. A blocked alley in darkness is a machine that injures its own operators. At 5 hours 1 minute and 2 seconds, a German voice called for a grenade. Nowak didn't wait for it. He reached down, took a homemade grenade from his pocket, tin can body, fuse cut from a match head assembly, explosive filling scraped from captured munitions and repacked. It was unreliable, but it was all they had. He pulled, counted 2 seconds, and threw. The can clanged off stone and disappeared into the mass of men at the alley mouth. At 5 hours 1 minute and 7 seconds, it detonated with a flat crack. Shrapnel tore through cloth and flesh. The blast was small compared to factory grenades, but in a packed space, small was enough. At 5 hours 1 minute and 10 seconds, the German firing stopped for a beat. Not because they were dead. Because they were trying to understand what had just happened. Nowak took advantage. At 5 hours 1 minute and 14 seconds, he rose just enough to fire another burst. He aimed at helmet level this time, knowing he'd draw return fire immediately. He wanted to buy seconds for the men at the barricade behind him to reposition the RKM. At 5 hours 1 minute and 18 seconds, a rifle round hit the bricks above his head and shattered. Dust and grit filled his eyes. He blinked hard and dropped flat. His heart rate spiked. He forced his breathing down. At 5 hours 1 minute and 32 seconds, he heard the RKM open up behind him, deep, heavy bursts. The Polish bar variant had a slower, steadier cadence than many belt-fed guns. It punched through the alley like a hammer. Each burst was short. Ammunition was too scarce to waste. At 5 hours 1 minute and 46 seconds, the German element began to withdraw. Not a rout. A controlled pullback, dragging wounded, stepping over fallen men, trying to recover order. They didn't run because running meant stepping on glass. The caltrop strip did what Żbikowski had promised. It forced slow movement. It forced bunching. It forced injury and hesitation right at the entry point. And it did it without using a single cartridge. At 5 hours 2 minutes and 11 seconds, the alley went quiet except for groans. Nowak didn't move. He stayed behind cover and listened for the sound of another push. He expected it. The Germans rarely accepted being blocked by a handful of insurgents. They responded with weight, more men, heavier weapons, fire. At 5:04, the district command post, 2 blocks away in a basement, received a report. A runner arrived breathless and dirt-streaked, shouting over the din of shelling. "Stopped in the alley," he said. They came in and stalled. Glass. It worked. At 5:06, Żbikowski heard the report. He was seated at a table with a candle stub and his notebook open. He didn't look up right away. He wrote the time. He wrote the location. He wrote one line, confirmed effect under fire. At 5:11, German mortars began to fall in the general area. The rounds were likely 81 millimeters, hard to say from sound alone, but the impacts were close, heavy, systematic. They were not random harassment. They were ranging. At 5:13, a mortar round landed at the far end of the alley. Brick fragments sprayed down the corridor like shot. Nowak felt the air pressure change. His ears rang. At 5:14, he crawled backward, inch by inch, toward the barricade. He kept the MP-40 forward. He did not stand. Standing in Warsaw meant dying fast. Behind him, at the barricade, the machine gun crew shifted positions again, moving the RKM to cover a different angle. The crew leader, Private Stefan Wolski, age 19, swapped magazines with hands that shook. He had fired too many bursts already. His fingers were raw. At 5:16, another German element appeared at the intersection, this time with a different posture. They didn't step into the alley immediately. They stayed back. A man with a long tube on his shoulder moved into position. Not a flamethrower, too bulky, too close. A Panzerfaust, disposable anti-tank weapon. Warhead designed for armor. In an alley, it was a demolition charge with a trigger. The Panzerfaust gunner aimed at the brick pile that formed Nowak's cover. At 5 hours 16 minutes and 22 seconds, Nowak saw the tube and understood. He did not have time to retreat. He did not have time to shoot the gunner cleanly. He had one option: change the angle. At 5 hours 16 minutes and 25 seconds, he rolled sideways into a doorway recess, 3 steps, tight, desperate. The doorway had no door, only a frame and darkness. At 5 hours 16 minutes and 27 seconds, the Panzerfaust fired. The backblast hit the alley wall and blew dust outward. The warhead struck the brick pile and detonated. The explosion was violent, focused, and close. Bricks became fragments. The alley filled with powdered mortar and smoke. Nowak felt the shock through the ground. He tasted grit. A piece of brick struck his cheek and split the skin. He didn't scream. He checked his hands, his legs. He was alive. At 5 hours 16 minutes and 34 seconds, the Germans shouted and surged, thinking the position had been neutralized. They advanced again. At 5 hours 16 minutes and 40 seconds, the first man stepped forward and hit the caltrop strip again because it was still there. The innovation had survived the blast. The bottle bases were low. They were hard to see. Some were shattered, but enough remained. The strip still denied the alley. At 5 hours 16 minutes and 45 seconds, the German advance slowed for the second time. The infantry charge that had been building broke into a cautious, uneven movement, men trying to step around invisible hazards while under machine gun threat. At 5 hours 16 minutes and 49 seconds, the RKM fired from behind the barricade, a disciplined burst aimed at the clustered helmets. At 5 hours 16 minutes and 55 seconds, Nowak added his MP40 bursts from the doorway recess, firing through dust and smoke at shapes he could barely see. At 5:17, the alley became what Żbikowski had engineered, a trap that didn't need a trigger. And the Germans, for the first time that morning, hesitated long enough for Warsaw's defenders to breathe. At 5 hours 17 minutes and 18 seconds, the German element fell back again. Not far, just enough to get out of the direct line of fire. They used the corner as cover. They shouted orders. A wounded man dragged himself by his elbows, leaving a dark trail on the wet stone. Nowak stayed in the doorway recess. He checked his MP40 magazine by feel. The spring still had tension. He counted rounds the only way he could, memory. 2 bursts, then another, then 2 more. He guessed he had 15 to 20 rounds left in the magazine. He didn't reload yet. Reloading meant exposing his hands and his focus. At 5:18, the mortar fire shifted. 2 rounds landed closer to the barricade. The Germans were adjusting. They were trying to break the defenders with blast and fragments because the alley itself was refusing them a clean entry. At 5:19, a runner arrived at Nowak's position from the barricade. The man was short, fast, carrying a cloth satchel. He leaned into the doorway and yelled over the noise. "Lieutenant wants to know what you used," he said. Nowak didn't waste words. "Glass teeth. Żbikowski's crates," he answered. The runner stared at him for half a second. He understood what that meant. The device had been banned. Using it meant disobeying orders. But the alley was still held, and in Warsaw, held ground had its own authority. At 5:20, the runner was gone. At 5:23, a German MG team set up at the corner, likely an MG-34, judging by the rate and tone when it opened. The weapon's fire was precise, sustained. It wasn't a burst of rifles. It was a machine gun trying to dominate the lane. The rounds hammered into the alley walls and chewed into the barricade timbers. Splinters flew. Dust rose. The defenders kept low. At 5:24, Wolski's RKM answered with short bursts, but the bar-pattern gun couldn't sustain the same volume. Its 20-round magazines forced constant reloads. Each reload was a pause. Each pause gave the enemy another second to think. Nowak watched the intersection and made a decision. At 5 hours 24 minutes and 30 seconds, he crawled forward, dragging his MP40 and a second magazine from his belt. He moved in inches, using the broken brick pile as partial cover, then the alley wall, then a collapsed drainpipe. He wanted to see the German MG team's position more clearly. He wanted a throw. At 5 hours 25 minutes and 5 seconds, he reached the edge of the Caltrap strip. He didn't cross it. He didn't need to. He reached into his pocket for another improvised grenade. He listened. The MG-34 fired in 5 to 7 round bursts. Discipline. An experienced crew. The gunner was probably prone, supported, with the assistant feeding the belt. The muzzle flashes reflected on the wet stone. At 5 hours 25 minutes and 18 seconds, Nowak timed the lull between bursts and threw. The grenade arced low, hit the corner wall, and bounced into the intersection. At 5 hours 25 minutes and 21 seconds, it detonated. The blast was partially shielded by the corner, but it was enough to disrupt the machine gun team. The firing stopped. At 5 hours 25 minutes and 28 seconds, the Germans shouted again, and now the sound was different. Not commands only. Anger. Surprise. They had expected the alley to be cleared by the Panzerfaust and the machine gun. It had not been cleared. At 5:26, the defenders behind the barricade used the pause to move casualties. A man with a shredded leg was dragged by his shoulders. A woman with a white armband, field medic, pressed a cloth to his thigh and shouted for a tourniquet. At 5:27, Nowak crawled backward again. He could feel fatigue in his shoulders and lower back. Not just physical. Cognitive. The strain of constant calculation, bullets, angles, time, noise, breath. He forced himself to stay slow and deliberate. At 5:29, a messenger reached Żbikowski with a written note, smudged with mud and soot. The message was short and blunt. Your glass devices held the alley twice. Panzerfaust failed. Request authorization to deploy in other lanes. Żbikowski read it once. At 5 hours 29 minutes and 30 seconds, he folded it carefully and put it into his notebook. Then he stood. He was not the district commander. He didn't have authority to reverse an order. But he did have one thing that mattered more than authority in that moment. He had a method that worked under fire, in a city where most methods failed. At 5:36, Żbikowski arrived at a sector staff position, moving through cellars and connecting basements to avoid streets. The route took him under 3 collapsed stairwells and past a makeshift dressing station where wounded lay on straw. He watched a medic cut a boot off a man's foot with a kitchen knife. The foot was swollen and purple. The man moaned without words. Żbikowski stopped for 2 seconds. He looked at the injury. He looked at the boot. He didn't flinch. He didn't avert his eyes. He understood the ban again, how friendly injuries could cripple a unit as surely as enemy fire. At 5:41, he reached the staff room. The commander, Captain Rzewski, was bent over a map lit by candle. The map was pre-war, outdated. Streets were marked that no longer existed. Buildings shown intact were now rubble. But it was all they had. Żbikowski spoke without ceremony. The alley held because of the caltrops, he said. We can do it again. But we need rules. Rzewski looked up slowly. He was 36, exhausted, with eyes that didn't blink enough. He had been awake for 48 hours. He had listened to too many reports of men dying with no ammunition to answer. At 5:42, he asked the only question that mattered. How many friendly casualties will it cause? Żbikowski didn't pretend to know the future. He answered with constraints. Only if deployed incorrectly, he said. It must be marked. It must be placed in channels where civilians are already evacuated. It must be mapped, logged, and recovered if we move positions. The strip must be on the enemy side of a controlled point, not in our own route. At 5:43, Rzewski rubbed his face with both hands. He looked at the map. He looked at the candle. He listened to mortar impacts in the distance. At 5:44, he made a decision that would have been routine in a normal army and was radical in a city uprising. He modified the ban. Not lifted. Modified. At 5 hours 44 minutes and 30 seconds, he dictated a new instruction. Glass caltrops authorized for use in defined kill lanes, only with unit level marking and recording. No deployment in evacuation corridors. No deployment in medical routes. All strips to be mapped on the sector sketch and reported to the nearest command post. It was the first time in the uprising that an improvised weapon was given a doctrine, not just a rumor. At 5:46, a runner carried the instruction to 3 barricades. The paper was folded into a matchbox for protection. The runner moved low and fast, using doorways as cover, crossing a street only when the German machine guns paused. Back at Świętokrzyska, at 5:52, the Germans tried one more push, smaller, cautious, probing. It was no longer a charge. The caltrops had changed their behavior. They moved like men who feared the ground. Nowak saw it and understood. The weapon didn't just injure. It shaped decisions. At 6:03, the defenders used the reduced pressure to reorganize. They repositioned the RKM to cover a longer angle. They moved a rifleman to a second-floor window. They laid another strip of glass further down the alley, in depth, forcing any penetration to bleed speed twice. At 6:10, the Germans stopped trying to take the alley with infantry alone. At 6:12, they brought in heavier fire, more mortars, then direct fire from a gun positioned down the street. The impacts were methodical. They were now trying to collapse the barricade and the surrounding walls rather than enter the lane. And that, in its own way, was a victory. It meant the enemy had been forced to spend more time, more ammunition, and more planning on one narrow alley than they had wanted to. It also meant the fight was entering its next phase, the phase where improvisations had to survive not just boots and rifles, but the weight of a modern army's firepower. At 6:18 on August 23, 1944, the first direct-fire round struck the barricade at Świętokrzyska. The projectile hit low and punched through timber, brick, and sandbags in one line, throwing a cone of debris into the defender's position. The weapon was likely a light infantry gun or anti-tank gun firing from a street intersection. Flat trajectory, fast arrival, no long whistle like a mortar. Nowak didn't wait to identify the model. In the alley, identification didn't matter. Survival did. At 6 hours 18 minutes and 12 seconds, he grabbed Wolski by the collar and pulled him down behind the inner wall. Wolski's RKM slid across the floor and clanged against a broken stove. The magazine popped loose. Rounds spilled into dust. At 6 hours 18 minutes and 20 seconds, a second shot hit. The barricade bucked like a living thing. A sandbag burst and dumped grit across the floor. A splintered plank tore open a man's forearm. He screamed and then bit his own sleeve to stop. At 6:19, the defenders began a controlled withdrawal to the secondary line. It wasn't a retreat in panic. It was planned. Żbikowski had insisted on depth, and Rzeszowski had listened. 2 positions. 2 angles. 1 alley designed to cost time. At 6:20, Nowak looked at the Caltrap strip one last time. He had placed it. He had fired over it. He had watched it work. Now he faced the rules Żbikowski had built into his argument. If you move, you recover it, if you can. He couldn't. The Germans were firing again. The alley mouth was under observation. A man who stepped into that open space would be hit. At 6 hours 20 minutes and 35 seconds, Nowak made the hard call. He left the strip behind and withdrew, crawling along the wall, then rolling into a cellar opening. The Caltraps remained in the alley like a silent squad that didn't need orders. At 6:23, the Germans advanced into the shattered gap. They moved slower now, probing the ground with rifle barrels and bayonets like men crossing ice. They had learned. They had adapted. But adaptation cost minutes, and minutes mattered. At 6:31, the secondary position opened fire. The RKM fired from a new angle, crossfire into the alley mouth. Riflemen on the second floor fired single, aimed shots. In the echoing stone corridor, each shot sounded like a hammer against a drum. At 6:38, the German element withdrew fully. Not defeated in the strategic sense, Warsaw would not be saved by one alley, but checked. Delayed. Forced to reroute. By 7:10, the sector staff received 3 separate reports from different barricades. Improvised glass caltrops had caused stalling, confusion, and reduced assault speed in narrow lanes. 2 reports mentioned wounded Germans being dragged out under fire. 1 report mentioned a German patrol refusing an alley entirely and taking a longer route through Open Street, where a sniper had killed 2 men. At 8:02, Rzeszowski formalized the instruction. It became a 1-page field directive, copied by hand and passed by runner. Placement: only in narrow lanes, stairwells, and choke points. Marking: friendly side marked with paint, chalk, or cloth. Mapping: sketched on the nearest command post plan. Control: unit leader responsible for removal if withdrawal possible. Restrictions: prohibited near medical routes and civilian corridors. Warsaw, under siege, had created a micro-doctrine for a weapon made of trash. Żbikowski's role changed after that morning. He was no longer just a sapper building charges. He became a coordinator, managing distribution, training, and standardization of whatever could be made in basements. On August 25th, at 1340, he ran his first formal instruction session. 10 fighters and 2 medics gathered in a cellar lit by a single lantern. On the floor, Żbikowski laid out the components: bottle bases, shards, wire, cement mixed with rubble dust, and cloth strips for marking. He spoke in plain language. He demonstrated how to angle the shards outward so a boot could not simply press them flat. He demonstrated how to wire wrap the base to reduce fracture. He showed how to place strips in depth, one near the alley mouth, 10 meters in, to create a second stall if the first was cleared. He also spoke about friendly casualties. He did not ignore the risk. He built procedures around it. At 1425, he assigned responsibility. Each strip would have a named leader. The leader would log the placement in a notebook: time, location, number of devices, marking method. It was crude staff work in a city without radios, but it created accountability. In the weeks that followed, the caltrops did not win fights. They did not stop tanks. They did not replace explosives. But they changed the cost equation in close terrain. They forced German patrols to move slower. They forced more probing. They caused more delays. They created more opportunities for insurgents to concentrate fire on stalled groups. They also created political friction inside the uprising. By September 2nd, at 10:10, reports of friendly injuries began to surface. A courier ran through an unmarked lane in darkness and shredded a foot. A wounded man on a stretcher was jostled when a bearer stumbled. A medic cursed Żbikowski by name, not because she hated him, but because she was tired of dealing with injuries that were avoidable. Żbikowski responded the way he always did, with stricter rules, not denial. At 11:30, he revised marking procedures. Cloth strips were to be tied at knee height on the alley wall, not left on the ground. Chalk arrows were to be placed on the friendly approach. If chalk wasn't available, soot mixed with water would be used. Every strip had to be announced verbally to new arrivals. Every strip had to be removed after an engagement if the position remained friendly. It was as close to a safety system as a besieged city could build. On October 2nd, 1944, the uprising capitulated. That is the larger arc that dwarfs this alley fight. The Home Army surrendered after 63 days. Civilians were expelled. The Germans systematically destroyed much of the city afterward. Żbikowski survived the surrender. He hid his notebook inside a wall cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, and marked the spot in his memory. He went into captivity briefly and escaped during a transport, moving with displaced civilians until he could vanish into the countryside. Nowak survived too, though not unscarred. The split on his cheek became a permanent line. He carried a slight limp from a later injury, a piece of shrapnel that never came out clean. After the war, under the new political order, men like them had complicated lives. Underground fighters were not always celebrated. Some were arrested. Some were watched. Some were forced into silence. Żbikowski avoided politics by returning to engineering, first as a laborer, then as a student again when it became possible. By 1951, he was working in industrial safety and small-scale design, the kind of work that kept his head down. He did not publish a memoir in the 1950s. He did not give interviews. He kept his notes private. In 1968, after a worker at his factory lost toes in an accident, Żbikowski reportedly wrote a short internal memo on hazards, marking, and human behavior in constrained spaces. He used no wartime language. But the logic was the same. People don't look down when they panic. If you want to control movement, you control the ground, and you mark what must be marked. In the late 1970s, long after the uprising had passed into history and rumor, Żbikowski retrieved his wartime notebook from the wall. He found it damp but readable. He rewrote portions, preserving times and locations. He added one sentence at the end of the entry for August 23rd, "Banned, then necessary." That phrase, more than the device itself, became his legacy among the few who knew the story. Not because broken glass was a miracle weapon. It wasn't. It was dangerous, limited, and morally uncomfortable. But it was an example of how desperate defenders adapt under pressure, how they build systems from ruins, argue over risk, and then revise doctrine with blood as the instructor. In later years, fragments of these improvised methods appeared in museums and archives, bottle bases with wired rims, sketches of alley defenses, notes about marking and recovery. Curators did not always display them. They were too small, too crude, too easily misunderstood. But to the men who held the alley at 5 o'clock, the lesson was clear and permanent. Warsaw did not have the luxury of perfect weapons. It had the necessity of workable ones. And in one wet alley behind Świętokrzyska Street, a strip of broken bottle caltrops, once banned, stalled an infantry charge long enough to change how a sector fought for the next hour, the next day, and, in small ways, the next generation of soldiers who studied urban ground.